All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about the Egyptian and Nubian empires. And so we're going to be looking at the region of the world still within the Fertile Crescent, but particularly around the Nile River. And so it's a really neat part of the world and a really powerful and prosperous part of the ancient world. And so first off, I just wanted to look at Egypt and kind of zoom in on that part of the world. Like Mesopotamia, like Sumer, this is a region of the world that connects three major land masses. So you've got folks coming in from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, all passing through Egypt and the rest of the Fertile Crescent. And so this part of the world was frequently conquered. In fact, dating back to 1640 BCE, the earliest records we have of people conquering and moving into Egypt were these people known as the Hyksos. And they were some of the first warriors to use chariots, as the picture illustrates. And so you may remember Friday we were learning about the Hebrew people and the religion of Judaism. And the Hebrews moved into Egypt from Canaan, and this dates back to about 1650 BCE. And so we have archaeological evidence that confirms the timeline here. And so, going back to the story of the Jewish people, it was these 12 sons of Jacob who became the 12 tribes of Israel that moved their families into Egypt because of a time of great famine. And they remained there and dwelt there for generations. And over time, the Egyptians began to resent the presence of the Hebrews and the Hyksos in Egypt. They saw them as outsiders, and they drove out the Hyksos and they enslaved the Hebrew people. And so it's very possible that the Hebrew people as slaves in Egypt were involved with the building of the pyramids and the building of many of these great Egyptian structures. Now, the Hebrew people have a long history of being conquered and rebelling and gaining independence. And so, we talked about this a little bit on Friday, how the Hebrew people moved out of Egypt and even against the Pharaoh's wishes and left, and then wandered around the Sinai Peninsula for a period of about 40 years and then moved into the realm of Canaan. And then this region was conquered by the Babylonian Empire. And so the Babylonians conquered the region of Canaan and in much of the area around Egypt. And then the Babylonians were overthrown by the Persians, and the Persians allowed the Jews to return to their homeland to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and the temple. But the area of Egypt continued to prosper and develop new technologies, and they were some of the first to use bronze weapons and chariots. And because of these new technologies, they were far more advanced than their neighboring city-states and regions, and so they were able to conquer other lands and to build up a prosperous empire. Now, in Egypt, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there was some version of gender equality. In fact, one of the most famous rulers of Egypt was a female pharaoh named Hatshepsut, and she was noted for building up a prosperous trading empire and really expanding economically without the need to expand through war. And so here's a statue made in honor of Queen Hatshepsut, whose reign lasted from 1490 BCE all the way through to 1436. And so you may hear me say BCE a lot. That just means before the Common Era. And so previously the term before Christ, and then AD for Anno Domini, or Latin for Year of Our Lord. And then today you'll hear more commonly BCE for before the Common Era.
Hatshepsut's image has suffered at the hands of early Egyptologists, men who felt a woman couldn't possibly do great things on her own. Herbert Winlock, who excavated Deir el-Bahari in the 1920s, believed that Senmut was the power behind
Okay, and so the New Kingdom of Egypt. Um, the next emperor I want to talk about here is Hatshepsut's stepson, Thutmose III, who expanded Egypt's trading empire. As you can see here, Lower Nubia, Upper Nubia, and really the reason it's called lower here is because this is the lower section of the Nile River as it fans out into a delta. Lower meaning it's further down the river, and then upper, referring to the upper reaches of the Nile, where it's coming out of the mountains. And this is also known as the cataract section of the Nile, where it's coming out of the mountains through steep rapids. And so Thutmose uh, expanded the Egyptian empire into these regions. And one of the common enemies throughout Egyptian history is a group known as the Hittites. The Hittites were a powerful tribe in Palestine. They were often rivals to the Egyptians, and really around the late 1200s BCE, Egypt's Pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittites signed a peace treaty. And so this really begins the new kingdom of Egypt, a time when the pharaohs were building these great palaces, magnificent temples, and again, most of this on the backs of slaves. Now, if you visit Egypt today, you can actually go to the Valley of Kings, which is near a city called Thebes, and it's where the pharaohs and many of these royal tombs are located. So, for example, here's the Great Temple of Ramesses II. Many of these pharaohs would commission these works at the beginning of their reign, and these works wouldn't be completed until after the pharaohs had died. And so they would spend much of their lives building their own tombs. And so the Egyptian Empire, um, what caused the decline? And if you go back to Egyptian records and begin to look at these hieroglyphs, you'll see reports of these sea people, and it's possibly a tribe in Canaan known as the Philistines, who were a very warlike race. They're even mentioned in the Old Testament or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Jewish Old Testament, talking about how they were a very warlike people, and they were commonly conquering and destroying places throughout Canaan as well as Egypt. There was another group called the Libyans, and they were a North African people who commonly would raid and attack parts of Egypt and parts of Palestine, and really this extended Egyptian empire began to weaken because of these people. In fact, as the empire was declining, they broke up, instead of a centralized empire controlled through Egypt, into a number of smaller kingdoms. And in fact, by 730 BCE, the kingdom of Egypt was ruled by an outside family from Libya.
Scholars
So, for this long period, Egypt really dominated a vast region. So, as far north as Canaan, as far south as Cush, which is that upper region of the Nile River, and the people there were called Nubia, and they're just the people who lived along the Nile River. But there's always this division between the lower section of the Nile, which is this prosperous, fertile region, and the upper section, which is less hospitable, less conducive to large farms, a very mountainous region. And so think about how people in mountainous areas in the agrarian time aren't able to have large farms. They typically aren't as prosperous as people who live in the lower areas. But the Nile River was an incredibly important place in the fact that if you're going to trade goods in the ancient world, they have to be traded along a river, typically moving goods downriver. And if you're going to locate a farm or locate a settlement, it needs to be next to a river. And so the Nile River, being a very large waterway in a very dry region, was incredibly important to these people, to the point that it was actually worshipped as part of the Egyptian religion. And so, here we're looking at just the Nile River. And so this region here called Nubia, this is the upper Nile that I was talking about. And then you even have people living along the Blue and White Nile, these tributaries to the Nile River. But then the really prosperous part, when you hear about ancient Egypt, you're often hearing about the lower section of the Nile. So Egyptian culture influenced a wide region. Throughout the upper reaches of the Nile, really extending, and you can hear the Egyptian language and you can see Egyptian artifacts even south of the Sahara Desert. And while Nubia gained independence from Egypt around 1200 BCE, they continued to speak the Egyptian language. They continued to use the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And even though Egypt was on the decline, by 751 BCE, in fact, they were conquered by a Kushite king. And then later, the Kushites were conquered by the Assyrians. And so, again, this region being commonly conquered, but the culture of Egypt and the legacy and the religion and the language endured. And so this is just a hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphic is a form of written communication where pictures tell the story. And so this is just a hieroglyph from the tomb of Ramesses II. So the Kushites settled in Meroe, which is a city-state along the Upper Nile. And there they formed a trading empire which extended all the way throughout the African continent, all the way through Arabia, and even as far east as India. They were an incredibly wealthy people, and they, for one, were a center for iron, which is a raw material dug out of the ground, and of course can be fashioned and shaped and turned to steel, and is really superior to bronze. So even though the Egyptians were the first to use bronze, iron became the more superior, the more advanced tools that could make better weapons, could be hardier and endure, and just allowed for so many more uses. And so these iron products were extremely valuable commodities that were being transported all throughout the ancient world. And as such, Meroe became an important and wealthy trading empire. Though they began to decline by AD 150, really as more places were beginning to source iron for themselves, and this monopoly they enjoyed on this incredibly lucrative commodity began to diminish. But now, further south is a kingdom called Aksum, which today we call the nation of Ethiopia. And Aksum developed a very unique culture, distinct from the rest of North and Central Africa, in the fact that they were monotheistic, that they actually adopted Christianity, and that they maintained their independence throughout the colonial era, and that they've never actually been conquered. Even Italy in the Second World War tried to conquer Ethiopia and never were able to. They're very fascinating people.